Welcome to theme 3, part 1 of this video. And in this theme, we're going to talk about water, something that we take as granted in our life. And for part 1, we're going to talk about the basic chemistry behind the formation of water and the properties. So last class, we learned about the concept that function actually comes from the structure for most of the biological molecules. And it's quite similar for water, although it's not necessarily a living thing. So we're going to talk about how the structure of water influences the function or the properties of water. So the really important premise to build here is that water is important. It essentially is the biological medium on Earth. This means that whatever reaction or biological processes that are going on in Earth has something to do with water or is essentially water-based. So all living organisms, they require water more than any other substance. So water essentially is the most important molecule for most living organisms. How can we tell that? Well, most cells are surrounded by water, and cells themselves are about 75 to 95% water. So let's say there's this cell. It's primarily surrounded by water, and actually the bulk majority is water-based. And the abundance of water on Earth is the main reason why Earth is a habitable medium. All right, so last class, we learned about bonding. And water has the symbol H2, meaning that there are two hydrogen atoms bonded to one oxygen, and it's a polar covalently bonded molecule. We learned that covalent bond happens between nonmetal and nonmetal, and it turns out both hydrogen and oxygen are nonmetals. So if nonmetals bond, they usually form a covalently bonded molecule. And we learned about what it means to be polar. So I'm just going to draw a schematic representation of H2O or water. So we have two hydrogen atoms that are being bonded to a single oxygen, okay? So we can technically argue that they are sharing valence electrons in order to meet the octet rule. And that has been established clearly throughout the last few videos. And if I say a molecule is polar, so let's talk about electronegativity. So we learned the concept of electronegativity, and we all learned that oxygen is one of the elements with highest electronegativity. So what's going to happen? So they're technically sharing valence electrons, but the oxygen atom is pulling the electrons more towards itself. So we have a net pull of electrons to the oxygen. So this means that the cloud of electron is denser on the oxygen part of H2O. This means that oxygen part is partially negative. And oppositely, the hydrogen end will be partially positive. So the oxygen end becomes the negative part of this molecule, and the hydrogen part becomes positive end of this molecule. So basically, if you look at an H2O molecule, we have a negative end, and positive end. So one end is negatively charged, and the other end is positively charged. We call this polar molecule. So water is polar. Okay, so based on these observations, we conclude that water is a polar molecule where opposite ends have opposite charges. And we call the characteristic of certain molecules that are polar polarity. Okay. So the nature of water being polar is polarity because it's one of the major attributes of a water molecule. Then why does it really matter? Why is it important to know that water is a polar molecule? So we have to learn about how a single H2O molecule and a single H2O molecule interact. These two water molecules, they're not bonded to each other, meaning that they're not sharing valence electrons. They're not actually tightly bonded. They're bonded between something called hydrogen bonding. Allow me to explain. So let's say we have two water molecules that are interacting. So I'm just going to draw two of them. Oopsies, this is the wrong direction. Oh, it is the correct direction. Okay, so we all know that the hydrogen end is positively charged, oxygen end negatively charged. So in physics, there's this one fundamental law called Coulombic law. This is this basic knowledge in physics that states that plus and minus, they attract. So when water molecules interact, what you observe is the partially negative oxygen end interacting with partially positive hydrogen end. And this will cause the water molecules, to interact or attract one another. And we call this type of bonding hydrogen bonding. So water interacts with one another via hydrogen bonding. So a formal definition is when a hydrogen atom covalently bonded to one electronegative atom, must be oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine. So this is oxygen, in this case, for the case of H2O, is also attracted to another electronegative atom. So let's just apply to the definition. So for water, we have a hydrogen atom, actually two hydrogen atoms that is covalently bonded to an electronegative atom, which is water in this case, which is oxygen in this case. And this hydrogen atom that is being partially positive due to high electronegativity of oxygen atom is being attracted by another electronegative atom, which is oxygen, which is partially negative. Okay? So this characteristics makes the attraction between one H2O molecule and another H2O molecule, and this interaction is called hydrogen bonding. Okay? So the schematic representation, I believe, well illustrates this. So you'll see the hydrogen end is attracted to the negatively charged oxygen end and vice versa, okay? So it'll arrange itself to attract one another in different angles, but just note that in a simple diagram, there's an attraction between the positive end and negative end. So now we have to learn about the properties. So we learned that water interacts via hydrogen bonding due to water molecules' polarity. But we have to learn about how this structure influences the property of water. So the first property that we're going to talk about is cohesion. Cohesion is a relatively simple thing. So cohesion is a property of water molecules holding themselves together. So it's simple. It's because hydrogen bonding between water molecule keeps the water molecules attracted to each other. So this technically is hydrogen bonding, right? So let's say you have a glass of water. Oopsies, that was a bad typo. So let's say you have a glass of water. So a bunch of water here. You see that these small water molecules are holding themselves together. They're not trying to separate, right? So this is because the hydrogen bonding between water molecules are keeping water molecules attracted to each other, right? Because water is a polar molecule. So what are the real life example of this? So one prominent example would be capillary action. So capillary is the part in plant where they're responsible for water transport. So you'll recognize that in real life, the roots of a plant, they absorb the water. So H2O is being absorbed from the root, H2O in the soil precisely. But you also recognize that this water has to be delivered to other parts. And it's quite interesting because in order to deliver this H2O molecules to other plant parts, let's say for leaf, the water has to travel upward. And you'll instantly recognize that gravity is pulling downwards, right? The force of gravity is pulling the water downwards. But this water is counteracting the force of gravity to go upwards. So how is this actually happening? So water actually is held, a bunch of water molecules is being held together so tightly by the cohesive forces between water. I'm just going to draw a water molecule, okay? So let's say this one water molecule is being used by cell in a leaf. Then there's this empty space, so this water molecule will go up, and the strong cohesive force between water is going to make this whole entire water molecule shift 1 unit upward, and it's going to keep stimulating this chain effect where pulling of water upwards against the force of gravity consistently and continuously happens. So this is because water attracts each other. They're being held very tightly due to the force of cohesion. Okay, so that explains cohesion. So adhesion is another property where water molecules are being attracted to another polar surface. So note that cohesion is a force of attraction between water molecules, but adhesion is property of water molecules that is being attracted to another polar surface. So let's just think about it. Let's say we have another polar surface, let's say plus or minus. So this is the surface. And we have water molecule that's being negative and positive. So we learned about the basic Coulomb's law. So the positively charged portion of the surface will be attracted to negatively charged portion or the oxygen end of H2 molecule or vice versa. So polar molecules essentially attract one another, and that property for water is called adhesion. Like let's say you just spilled a water on a table. Okay, so assume this is a table and you just happen to spill a water. So does water and table repel? Does it really repel? Does it like move away from one another? Not necessarily. You'll see that water is quite sticking to a table because table also is a polar molecule, is a polar surface, okay? So you here have to learn that polar attracts polar. There's a complicated chemical reason behind it, but we do not have to know this for the sake of AP biology. So in real life, you'll see that adhesion also playing an effect for capillary action as well. So how? So we learned about cohesion where water molecule is being pulled upward due to cohesive force between the water molecules. You'll also have to recognize that water molecules are also being attracted to the polar surface or the polar stem. So stem or the vessel, or in precise terms, the xylem that helps the water to be transported to integral parts of the plant, it contains a polar surface. So it provides like the stable container where water could be transported going against the force of gravity. Let's say, for instance, the container or the surface was non-polar, meaning that it would repel polar molecules. Then what's going to happen is that because the container itself isn't too stable, it's not really supporting the water molecules to stick together, the plant will likely fail because water wouldn't be transported upward easily. So you'll see both adhesion and cohesion collaborating to make capillary action possible in plant. Okay, so the next property that we're going to learn about is surface tension. Surface tension, by textbook definition, is the tendency of a liquid surface to resist rupture when placed under tension or stress. So you'll see, let's say you have a droplet of water, okay? It's going to form like this parabolic shape, right, for a droplet of water. And you'll see that the surface here is very tense. Like it makes its own shape, right? This property is called surface tension. Or let's just give you guys a familiar real life example. So let's say this is a lake and a person is diving from 45-meter distance. So he or she is engaged in a free fall. And you recognize that this likely hurts, right? He likely break a bone. Right? It will hurt. So why does it hurt? Because the water has this high surface tension where the surface itself is so tense, it has its own shape that it is resisting rupture when placed under tension or stress. So because water itself is making a strong surface, it will make you hurt very, very much when you dive from, let's say, 45 meters distance, because it tends to resist rupture, but you're trying to give it a stress, right? So a bunch of force will be acting on you. So why does this surface tension happen? So let's say in a water droplet, you see a bunch of water molecules that are making up the surface of a water droplet. And we learned that water interacts with one another via cohesion. So water molecules next to each other will be pulled to next to one another. So it's going to pull like this. So it's pulling one another horizontally. But water molecules on the surface at the same time, they're pulled inward as well in this direction due to the water molecules inside, right? So this net pull horizontally and vertically makes this droplet structure. And the strong pull between the water molecules is making the surface very tense and strong. And this characteristic makes it resist rupture when placed under the tension or stress, making it very difficult to break the surface of water molecules. So this is partly due to the strong cohesion, due to strong hydrogen bonding between water molecules. And one real life example would be water strider. So you'll see that humans really cannot walk on water, but water striders can. So water striders, they have extremely light weight, right? So their weight is not large enough to actually break the surface of water, which is really, really strong due to strong cohesive force and strong hydrogen bonding between water. So it makes the water striders float on water due to the high surface tension. Now we're going to learn about another property. It's a property called specific heat. Specific heat is the substance of a substance. It's the amount of heat that must be absorbed or lost for 1 gram of the substance to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. This might be difficult to understand, but in essence, it defines how much heat is needed to raise a substance by 1 degree Celsius in temperature. So what does it mean to have a high specific heat? So when a substance has high specific heat, it means that it takes a lot of energy to raise its temperature. And when it has low specific heat, it'll mean that it takes not too much of energy to raise the temperature of a substance. So the case for the water is that water has a really high specific heat, meaning that it takes a bunch of energy to change its temperature. So in essence, this brings up a new point, that water, in fact, is resistant to temperature change. So one real life example that we might want to take a look at it is California. So you'll see that I'm pretty sure this is summer, like let's say it's August. You'll see that for inland regions where there's this absence of water, there's a high temperature. Because whatever sunlight that they receive, the temperature will directly reflect it. But you'll also recognize that the regions where the water is nearby, they have a relatively low temperature. So this is because water has high specific heat, meaning that water is able to resist temperature changes. So regions that lack water wouldn't be too much resistant to temperature change when given a certain energy, while the region where water is abundant would be resistant to temperature change because it would take a lot of heat to raise its temperature, okay? So the reason is, so why does water have a high specific heat? So why? So let's say you recognize that water is bonded by something called hydrogen bonding. And this strong hydrogen bonding will be absorbing energy. It will be keep absorbing energy when given, let's say, a sunlight or a source of energy or heat, okay? So it's keep absorbing that energy, making water itself very resistant to temperature changes due to hydrogen bond. So it essentially takes a lot of energy to break this hydrogen bonding because hydrogen bonding is keep absorbing that energy. So at the same time, it'll be resisting all those temperature changes because it is absorbing a bunch of heat due to hydrogen bonding. So this hydrogen bonding itself is absorbing energy, okay? So why is it important? The high specific heat of water is important because it minimizes that temperature change or fluctuations within the limits that permits life. So let's say, for example, our organisms, any living thing is based on a liquid substance that is very prone to temperature fluctuations. It means that during summer, our temperature might go up to 50 degrees Celsius due to those excessive heat, which will pretty much cause a significant damage to all of our cells and essentially, in the end, make us die. But because water minimizes that temperature fluctuations due to high specific heat, it is able to minimize temperature fluctuations that might actually kill those living organisms. So that's why high specific heat is very significant. And the next property is something called heat of vaporization. It is very similar to high specific heat. So heat of vaporization is the heat or energy a liquid must absorb in order for 1 gram of it to be converted to gas. So it essentially defines how much heat we need to vaporize something into gas. So water has high heat of vaporization, meaning that it takes a lot of heat to convert the liquid form of water into gas. So it's same thing. So water has a strong hydrogen bond. In a liquid structure, these hydrogen bonds are being held very tightly. But let's say we're trying to boil water to make it into a gas format. This will mean that we're overcoming all these hydrogen bond forces and separate these water molecules entirely. So we essentially have to break that hydrogen bond in order to completely vaporize a water molecule in order to make them into a gas form, because gas molecules are dispersed widely, right? They're free-floating molecules, and they're the concept of kinetic molecular theory. So you'll also recognize that hydrogen bonding between water is very strong. So at the same time, it takes a lot of energy just to separate them into widely dispersed gas molecules. So yeah, so this contributes to the concept of high heat of vaporization of water, where it's really difficult. It just takes a lot of energy to vaporize a water molecule. All right, then why is this beneficial? Okay, let's just think about this. Let's say we're in Dubai, where in summer it might go up to 50 degrees Celsius. Think about it. Some water molecules inside us might end up vaporizing if we have a low heat of vaporization for water. So having a high heat of vaporization, it limits the amount of water that is being vaporized, because if we lose all the water in the cells due to vaporization, it'll be fatal for us because we're losing that water, which is an integral part of our life. So if water had this low heat of vaporization, our cells might end up being a gas-based living thing, which is insane. Okay, so at the same point, we have this another property called evaporative cooling. So in the same time, we just learned that it takes a bunch of energy to break the hydrogen bond. So hydrogen bond, in simple words, is stacking energy. And I also explained that when we're vaporizing a water molecule into gas form, we're like completely separating the hydrogen bonds between water molecule. Then what happens to the energy that is being stacked between the hydrogen bond? It just dissipates, meaning that it's going away. So it means that whenever we vaporize a water molecule, we're just cooling it, where the temperature goes down because hydrogen bonding is completely overcome, it's broken, and the energy that hydrogen bond was stacking, it just dissipates, it's being lost. So why is this concept called evaporative cooling? So let's say this is the skin of any animal, including ourselves. So let's say we sweat during summer. So let's say the water molecules here, which comprises the majority of a sweat, it just vaporizes. So until it vaporizes, right before it vaporizes, it stacks a bunch of energy, right? Because there's this hydrogen bonding between water molecules, and this hydrogen bonding is just stacking a bunch of energy from the sunlight. But as soon as this water molecule vaporizes. As soon as when a sweat vaporizes or evaporates, the energy is lost. So energy is released, right? So it causes a sudden temperature decrease, cooling the surface. So we're cooling the surface, okay? So this effect is called evaporative cooling. This is why we sweat when we're really, really warm or hot. By sweating, we're exploiting the system of water's property. In summer, we sweat, and as soon as the sweat vaporizes, it's just releasing a bunch of energy, cooling our skin surface, allowing us to stabilize temperature in organisms and bodies of water. So think about it. We sweat when we have fever. So when we have fever, it means that we have a really high body temperature, meaning that if it goes over a certain range of temperature, we might start losing our life. So as a defense mechanism, we sweat because as soon as the sweat vaporizes, it's losing a bunch of energy, causing the surface to cool down to a significant extent, so decreasing the temperature. So that's the innate defense mechanism that our body has. So sweating is one primary example of evaporative cooling. The next property that we're going to learn about is floating ice. So we learned that whatever with lower density floats. And generally, by default, solid has the highest density, then liquid, then gas. But you'll recognize that frozen form of water or ice, they'll be floating on water, which is counterintuitive, right? Because we learned that whatever with lower density flows, and it's the general understanding that solid is the most dense. So technically, the ice will have to sink down in the medium of liquid water, right? So why does solid form of water, ice, float? So let's read this. In the liquid form of water, hydrogen bonds continue to break and reform at intensely fast rate. So in a liquid form, hydrogen bonds break and reform very, very quickly. So it means that they're just talking to each other, then talking to one another, attracted to one another, then the bond breaks. So this happens at an intensely fast rate. And you just have to recognize that the same hydrogen bonding is not being kept consistently. It's just breaking and reforming over and over and over between the water molecules. So that's what's happening between liquid water molecules. So this makes the water very dense because water molecules are closely packed because of the hydrogen bondings, breaking and reforming at a very consistent and fast rate. But in ice, we see something called crystal structure, where hydrogen bonds are no longer moving, they're stable, right? Because they no longer can move to one another or break or reform. This makes the hydrogen bond space apart like this. So this makes the water, the ice form, less dense compared to the liquid form of water. So this makes the ice float. So in liquid form, to summarize, hydrogen bonds are breaking and reforming due to the high polarity of water molecules. So they're closely packed because it's interacting, breaking, interacting, and doing that all over and over at an intensely fast rate. So it's really packed and dense. But for ice, things are spaced apart because hydrogen bond can no longer form and break because they're in this, they're jailed in this crystal structure, right? So they're very stable. It makes ice less dense due to this, due to the hydrogen bonds being spaced apart and stable. So this makes ice less dense, thus floating on a liquid medium of water. Okay, so why is this important? So because ice is floating during winter, let's say this is the lake. So only the upper part is the ice because ice floats, right? So this allows the life below to persist, right? Let's say if the ice sinks down, all of the plant life will be devastated, right? And because the surface is also very cold, it'll just freeze. So the entire lake would freeze if ice weren't to float, because they're keep stacking and stacking from below, right? Due to the cold surface temperature. But with ice floating on water, this also provides insulation where temperature is consistent, because ice is preventing the interaction with the cold surface or the cold air, making this the below part, the liquid part, and its temperature quite stable, providing insulation. So it allows aquatic organisms to survive in the water during winter. Okay. So that was it for today's video. Today, we just talked about water's chemical structure and how it corresponds to the properties such as adhesion, cohesion, surface tension, high specific heat, high heat of vaporization, evaporative cooling, floating ice, etc. Right, so it is really important to understand how structure in biology dictates the function. And I think water, although itself is not a living organism, well describes this property, where we see that the chemical nuance of a water molecule and the corresponding chemical interaction contributes to the function or the properties of it. So in the next video, we're going to talk about water as well, but a different part of it, we're going to talk about water as a solution and pH in water. But for now, that's all you need to know for today. All right, so I'll see you in that next video and have a great day.